Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on a watercolor illustration that I've painted recently. I'm going to take you through and just show you step by step how I created this painting with all the layers and the different washes and different watercolor techniques that I used for it. So I'm starting with a wet on dry wash. That's how I put that yellow color down. And the secret when you do this kind of a wash really is to never allow the edges of your paint to dry, because that's when you end up getting lines and the color gets uneven. So I'm working fairly quickly here, and if you can see, I'm continuing to bring that yellow down before the edges of it get dry, and I go back in while it's still wet and add little dabs of red so that I get some orange color variations in there. If you're wondering about the watercolor pigments I use, in my palette I have I think it's 3 different kinds in this palette. I have Winsor Newton professional watercolor paints, and I also have a couple of Daniel Smith colors, which are kind of fun because they're a more granulating watercolor. They tend to produce more blooms and uneven pigmentation, if that's the kind of thing you like. And I also have some Graham watercolors. And as far as the colors and the quality, I feel like they're all very similar. Right here I'm getting ready to paint around these birds, and I need to leave them white so that I can go back over them with color later. So I'm using a fine liner masking fluid. And a lot of people will have trouble with masking fluid ripping the paper, but I've found that if I use Arches watercolor paper, it's a little bit more expensive than the other kinds of watercolor paper on the market, but so far, as of this date, it is the only one that I've found that I can use masking fluid with and not rip the paper when I pull it off. So I'm getting ready to put a rain texture on. So I got the paper all wet. Now I'm going to take dark. It's probably Payne's Gray. That's one of my favorite pigments for making bleeds and blooms. For some reason, it's just no matter what brand it is, it seems to always produce the coolest looking bleeds. So I'm putting it up high by the clouds because I want the rain to look like it's dripping down. And I'm going to put a lot of paint on and use a lot of pigment here. And then I'm using water to just draw it down in places where it's trying to dry a little bit. And I'm tipping the board so that the paint runs down, and dabbing some of it off when it starts to run too much. And then I'm tipping it back the other way and to the side. And you've got to kind of keep going over it and playing with it. See, now it's getting some really nice rain textures in there, but that little spot started to dry, so I had to put a little bit more water on. Adding more dark colors up on top. This is probably an M. Graham watercolor, Payne's Gray. So the colors that I've used in this, I always try to keep my palette fairly limited when I paint because it helps to unify the painting. So I'm using, it looks like, let's see if I can remember, I believe I was using lemon yellow and phthalo turquoise, Payne's Gray, and probably quinacridone rose. So that's my favorite red pigment. So those are the 4 pigments that I used, the 4 colors that I used to create this painting. So all the different variations of colors are done with just those 4 pigments. More of the oranges, greens, those secondary colors, it helps to unify your painting more because you're mixing those oranges and greens, whatever color, from from pigments that you're already using in the rest of your painting. So now that I've got my whole background done, or just about done, I'll probably have touch-ups later. I'm going to go in on top and paint my little characters. And that again is a wet on dry wash. And again, I'm making sure to keep my edges nice and wet so that I don't get lines. And before it dries, I go in and I add a little bit of red dabbed on him so that he gets that blended color. You don't have to really blend it with the brush. Just dab it on the wet paint and the watercolors will do the work for you. So I'm just finishing him up with a little bit more of that quinacridone rose, and I used water to lift off his belly a little bit there to make it a little bit lighter. And then I'm starting on my other characters. And again, this is an orange that's blended from lemon yellow and quinacridone rose. Oh, had to finish up his wings. And there's that phthalo turquoise. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous color. That's me. I'm using it straight there and blending a little bit of yellow in for his wing. And then my favorite thing to do for details on my watercolor illustrations is to go back in with colored pencils over the top and use colored pencils to add in the details. It's hard, at least for me, to get those really sharp details with paints. I know some people are really good at it, but I found that this is a technique I really like. I'm using Faber-Castell Polychrome there. They are my favorite colored pencils for doing this sort of a thing with. I use Prismacolors as well from time to time, but I found that the Prismacolors are just a little bit softer and it's harder to keep a nice sharp point with them. And I really like the sharp point for the detail work that I'm doing. So Faber-Castell Polychromes are my favorites. They are a wax colored pencil, so they've got a really rich, vibrant color. Some people like to do this sort of work with an ink fine liner, and that looks really nice too. I used to do that, but I found that the quality of line I get with colored pencils, I just seem to have more control over it, so that's why I've switched to using colored pencils instead of ink pens. And I just like the way it looks with more color there instead of just black. It gives it kind of another dimension. When I choose what color I'm going to use to outline with, I usually go with a darker version of whatever color I am tracing around. So for the yellow, a dark yellow wouldn't really show up very well, so I decided to go with the dark red. And the same for the orange dragon. And then when I get up to the little blue guy, I'm going to use a really dark blue. And since white colored pencils don't show up very well on dark colors, they tend to kind of look just muddy and pale, I decided to take my finished piece into Procreate and put in the lightning strikes digitally. I also added some rain texture to the bottom part. So I am happy to answer any questions about my process that you might have. You can drop them in the comments below, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial.